Welcome to the Chain Reaction Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. With a rotating cast of faculty, alumni experts, and guest contributors, we strive to help listeners understand the people and processes that produce and distribute products around the world. Listen to this first episode as experts explore supply chain effects on global commerce, humanitarian issues, critical raw materials, and the future amid the Russian-Ukraine war.
Hello, everyone, and who's watching and listening to us today. Welcome to the first in a series of podcasts from the world-famous Supply Chain Department at W.P. Carey at Arizona State University, where we will talk all things supply chain and that impact all of us. In these short podcasts, and yes, short, and they said professors cannot be succinct. So we will show it to you. We will try to address the burning supply chain question of the moment. And today, the topic is war in Ukraine and its impact on supply chain. My name is Hitendra Chaturvedi. I'm a professor of practice in the Supply Chain Management Department, and I will be your moderator today. We have gathered an amazingly accomplished panel today, starting with the Venerable Dale Rogers, Iryna Printezis, and Christopher Lee. They're all with the Supply Chain Management Department, and they will be answering some of the questions that I will be posing to them on your behalf. And please note, the primary question gets about 2 minutes, and the other two panelists are going to get 30 seconds to either add on to it or violently disagree with it. So without further ado, let's start with Dale. Dale's supply chain had already been struggling post-pandemic. Products were going up in prices, there's supply constraints, and now we have the war in Ukraine. Everybody's wondering how much will it impact this already stressed supply chain? How will it impact me? Which areas will be most impacted? Which one will not be impacted? So I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
You know, it's really interesting how connected the world is. We've had leaders in a lot of different countries who have been kind of confused about this as we see sort of nationalism sweeping around the world when it really doesn't make sense. You know, the last 40 years, supply chain managers and firms have really built these multinational supply networks, and those are more threatened than they've ever been before. The obvious place where the Ukraine war hurts, the one that's the easiest to see was oil and gas, and you know, Russia is a huge exporter of oil and gas. Several of the petroleum companies, you know, get a lot of their oil from Russia. So that's an obvious one. But then there's really important areas where maybe not everybody knows. You know, we already have a semiconductor shortage. We've got semiconductor fabs in a lot of the wrong places to some extent. Firms are looking for geographic diversity all of a sudden, and it's hard to put a new fab up at $20 billion. And then about 50% of the world's neon, which you use for you know, fabricating semiconductors, comes from the Ukraine. So there's a lot of places where this is a real problem through the global supply chain.
Oh, thank you, Dale. Chris, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I agree with Dale on each of those, especially when it comes to the oil and the issue with semiconductors, with 50% of it coming from the sources coming from the Ukraine.
Thank you, Chris. Iryna, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so as Dale pointed out, we always have to consider the global supply chain that affects prices and products that we see in the US. So given the recent events, companies have to reevaluate and adapt their supply chains to all the imposed sanctions so that they are not violating them. And some have to actually find new suppliers for their materials. And companies are also being affected by the transportation costs. And we're not only talking about the ground transportation, but air and sea as well. Airlines, for example, are not only hit by the fuel costs, but also no-fly zones, which adds additional hours to their routes. So all that, unfortunately, will have to be factored in everything we buy.
Great answers. And Chris, I'm going to move towards you in a way because you gave such a fantastic answer. Let's talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Let's talk about China. China is a pivotal player in global supply chain. How do you see their role evolving, assuming in two scenarios, if the war goes longer or if the war is shorter?
So obviously China is a huge player. The whole globalization idea has been based on China's ability to provide a huge amount of labor at a very low cost, and also the fact that you've got a beneficial currency trade idea with other nations, and China just put them in that wonderful place. Short term, provided China does not do anything in collaboration with Russia, I think it'll be very similar to what we've dealt with in COVID, where there's going to be these gaps from time to time. There's certainly the closing of cities and factories in China, depending on what's going on with COVID. They've got a different approach to that than most of the Western world, where they believe in lockdown as opposed to vaccinations. And so that's also caused this problem before the war. But they've also made it very clear that they do not agree with the sanctions the Western world has imposed on Russia. They think it's a bridge too far, a step over. And the Western world, with Joe Biden last week, making it clear that if they do end up doing some kind of collaboration or assistance to Russia, there will be sanctions on China as well. That's kind of the wild card of the moment. The moment we've got sanctions on China on top of the sanctions we've already got on Russia, then we've closed off a huge part of the world for both our supplies and for our production. Now, short term, as I said, it should be easy. Long term, it could be an issue. I do think the silver lining to this is it might get us back to more of this home-shoring and near-shoring philosophy. Part of the fissures we showed during COVID-19 was that we got to a globalization perspective without realizing that there was a lot of risk in that. And I'm thinking this war now between Russia and the Ukraine, the invasion of the Ukraine, is showing that we've got even further issues in a global world. It's a new paradigm to go to this globalization idea. It's only happened in the last 25 years. It's a beginning of the new millennium almost. And so I think we're learning through that process. And so hopefully we learn from it and we continue to utilize China where it becomes strategic, but we don't rely on them when it becomes our detriment.
Dale, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We have seen China and really the US pivoting away from each other for the last few years. China has been really puzzled by the crazy tariffs we put on when we're so dependent on them. Shortages from the pandemic, problems with shipping, and so on have really increased the amount of inflation. And so China is a critical player. And honestly, I think that Xi Jinping, the chairman of the party in China, is probably confused a little bit about what to do, because it's hard to justify Russia's action, but he's clearly in retreat from the West, and it's going to have a lot of impact on the supply chain.
Thank you, Dale. And let me move on to my next question. And Iryna, I'm gonna ask you this question. One thing we don't talk about much in supply chain is the human part of supply chain. Yes, there is a huge humanitarian crisis that is unfolding today, but in front of our eyes. But we're also seeing a huge movement of what I call human capital out of Ukraine into various parts of Europe. How does that impact the supply chain in Europe and globally?
Well, that's a good point. Well, the population of Ukraine before the invasion was 43 million. And since the war has started, 10 millions of people have been displaced in the country. But according to UN, almost 3.5 million refugees have actually left Ukraine. Out of them, 1/3 is children and 2/3 are mostly women. So currently there are over 2 million of women that can potentially join the European workforce. At the same time, European economy has been experiencing some worker shortages in the various sectors over the last years. So for example, there were approximately 700,000 job openings in Germany and over 1 million job openings in UK. The lack of workers is causing the delays and disruptions in supply chain, as well as the increase in the costs. So European countries that welcome Ukrainian refugees try to integrate them into their labor market by either giving them a working permit or giving them a special visa. This might help Europe to address their labor shortage, as well as allow refugees to regain their financial stability. The problem, however, is that women who arrive to their host countries don't have home, don't know the language, have kids to take care of, and they hope that this trip is short. So they may not be able to work under these circumstances. And those that can work may work some jobs that don't require certain certifications, license, or specific accredited degree. So in the short run, there are some challenges that will need to be addressed before we will see some real impact of human capital from Ukraine on the hosting countries' economies or supply chain. And in the long run, if the war continues, Ukrainian refugees will have time to assimilate and they will be able to better address the labor shortages in various industry sectors.
No, thank you. Dale, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, a crazy couple of statistics about refugees. There's about 20 million refugees around the world right now, and the average length of time. Now, this wouldn't include the Ukrainians, but average length of time once someone is a refugee, how long they stay a refugee is 17 years. It's a tremendous problem, and it's going to be unsettling throughout Europe, and probably we're going to be affected by it here as well in Arizona, across the US.
Chris, any thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm agreeing with the care and feeding portion of this, also the language difficulties. We've seen a lot of this through Europe over the last number of years. We're certainly seeing it from South America into North America. And if we look at this past the current invasion of the Ukraine, we look at global change, and we're going to see more of this refugee migration push moving forward. So part of it is, how do we then bring this potential labor force into a new market and get them the training they need, the care and feeding they need, and the food they need. Not to mention the reconstruction of the Ukraine after this, which I think will be very similar to what happened after World War II and the Marshall Plan, just based on the devastation we've witnessed.
Oh, thank you. And Chris, I'm going to stay with you. Dale brought up this point in his first answer, so I want to talk a bit more about that. Let's talk about energy. High gas prices all across. We are suffering from it. And people ask, is that because of Ukraine?
Yeah, and partial answer is some of the cost is because of the current situation between Russia and Ukraine. Part of this is because it was already starting to happen. The pandemic threw a bit of a monkey wrench into the normal equilibrium of supply and demand for oil prices. And that the factor that kept a lot of this in check was the fact that the pandemic put a brake on some of the demand for a while. And so we go back 2 years ago, we had barrel of oil prices at a negative number and gasoline prices at the pump at a low number. Now, as demand has increased, but production hasn't increased at the same level, we've got a higher price at the pump. The war in the Ukraine obviously is adding to that because energy is a global economic phenomenon, not a domestic one. Now, we are an exporter here in the United States of oil and natural gas, but it's a world market. And so because our companies want to export it, they're going to sell it to whoever is willing to pay the most for it. The upside of this is if prices continue to be somewhere around this or just under it, say around $3.50 domestically, then they might increase oil production, and that'll help us in the long run. Increases production, increases jobs, good for the supply chain, allows us to have more oil in the supply chain. It also might mean that we go more to an energy independent philosophy and start looking at some other possibilities outside of oil moving forward. And certainly some of the infrastructure plan that just got passed would help with some of that infrastructure and moving towards that. And when gasoline prices are high, we tend to have more favoritism towards that idea, both here nationally and internationally.
Thank you. Dale, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think unpacking the energy problems are going to be huge. This is going to increase sort of the trajectory where consumers are moving to electric cars. You're gonna see this along, and for several other reasons as well. But this is going to dramatically increase the movement. We're going to probably see growth in the electric car market share probably in the next year grow about what would have been 3 or 4 years worth of growth if this hadn't happened.
So you're basically talking about a new supply chain that all of us should be focusing on, which is the EV side of it. And the war and the energy crisis is expediting that. Iryna, any thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to mention that as of last week, the average price of gasoline around the world was $5 per gallon, with the US average gas prices being a little under $5. At the same time, the gas prices in Europe were higher than that even before the war started. Since Europe doesn't produce any oil and completely depend on others, the average gas prices there, for example, were above $8 in France and Sweden and above $9 in Italy and Germany. There are obvious other things that work differently in Europe, but this is something to think about.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's a very, very good point. Dale, I have a question for you. Let's visualize 2 scenarios. One in which the war finishes off quickly, and then the other one in which it just is a war of attrition, keeps on going, and like a cancer in Europe, it starts to infect everybody around it. How will the global supply chain adapt to both the scenarios?
Well, it's funny. The harder one actually is probably if the war finishes quickly, where you have a long-term issue. Usually, managers are able to figure that out. If you think about the stock market, how quickly they price in a crisis, and then think, okay, we've dealt with that. That's kind of how supply chain managers are as well. I believe in something that I call the 3-month rule. And I really made this up following the tsunami in Japan several years ago. So I had a bunch of former students that were working in Japan, and I sent notes to them when the tsunami happened. One was with Toyota and a couple with other companies. And I said, hey, how are you guys doing? Are your companies affected at all? And they all said, yeah, we're okay. The tsunami was close to me, but no, it doesn't have any impact on our company. And then 2 or 3 months later, they found out, wait a minute, our supply networks stretch into companies that were maybe put out of business or at least crushed kind of with the tsunami. And you don't necessarily realize that until about 2 or 3 months later. I say 3 months. There's a famous story about Evonik, which made a resin makes a resin called PA12, and in April of 2012, the big plant blew up, and all of a sudden, on a day in June where I was speaking to a bunch of automobile companies, they found out that moment that their supply chains were impacted in ways they didn't know. So April to June, not quite 3 months, but we're going to see people realizing the impact, not right away. So we're about a month into the war. I'm going to guess probably late April, maybe May or early June. There's a lot of companies going to realize, wait a minute, we got serious problems here.
Thank you. Iryna, do you agree, disagree?
Well, I also think if the war in Ukraine will continue for a long period of time, then global supply chain will also suffer further due to the long-term implications of all the events and sanctions imposed. And then slowly with time, it will start adapting to new conditions and we may see some improvements.
Chris?
Yeah, I agree. A lot of the companies right now are dealing with safety stock to kind of get over this, hoping it's going to be a short-term idea. Short term, basically, we're looking at rebuilding afterwards and hopefully a number of things going back as quickly as possible. But as we've talked about already, it's going to take a long time before the Ukraine would be able to provide what they have to the semiconductor industry. Oil and gas throughout Europe from Russia will take some time because new deals will have to be made. Long term, I think we're going to be looking at alternative sources throughout the world. And it might mean that we're looking at we went from a globalization to more of a regional coalition type idea. And I foresee if it does go long term, it'll be North America working with the European Union, possibly bringing Africa into part of this. And I foresee China and Russia possibly being, another entity if this exceeds past that 3 month, 4 month timeframe. If it becomes something like a 20-year war that we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, then I think we're going to have to reconfigure pretty much everything at that point. But on the upside, we've been thinking through some of this before this happened with those ideas in mind based on how we're approaching things. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, no, thank you. Let me ask one last question, all three of you. Let's end this session on a positive note, optimistic note. I know there are challenges, but if all three of you were to look into your crystal ball and told us, look for these three indicators, and if there is a improvement in these three indicators means there is a light at the end of the tunnel. What would those indicators be? And I will start with you, Dale. What would you recommend for all of us to look for that will tell us that there is a light at the end of the tunnel?
I actually think that we can see some lights at the end of the tunnel right now. I am sure that Vladimir Putin is quite surprised by the unity of the West. I don't think he anticipated, Europe and the United States being so strong together. There's a view around the world that that democracy is an old-fashioned idea and isn't really competitive in this time where things are moving so quickly. A democracy can't keep up, and really the only way to go is an autocracy. And I would bet that the senior folks in Russia were quite surprised by the unity. And honestly, to me, this sort of global unification is quite hopeful, because in supply chain, we know that nationalism is mostly a dumb idea. And we built this amazing economy, several economies around the world, and to sort of dismantle that and become nationalistic doesn't seem like progress. And so I think one of the best things to maybe come out of this war will be sort of a lot of the countries in the world collaborating again.
Thank you. Chris, your three indicators.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of the same part of what Dale had mentioned earlier, the coalitions around the world that we have seen, but more on an economic standpoint, right, where we can help each other in different ways. I see that as a key indicator, and certainly the European Union and what used to be called NAFTA, now the USA, Mexico, Canada Act, working together in collaboration. And we're seeing a lot of that through NATO and through the UN. I see the beginning of inflation going down as a consumer indicator that demand is starting to align with supply, right? Where we're able to meet the demand with the supply that we have, certainly in food prices, energy as well. And then I think the other chief indicator is a move again to that home shoring, near shoring, as we're watching more facilities coming back to the United States or to Canada and Mexico, specializing across those three countries, utilizing our collective advantage and yet keeping things closer so we don't have the large transportation requirements that we learned under COVID. I think those are all indicators, and I think we're already on the road towards all three of those things.
And Iryna, you have the last word.
Yeah, so if I had to name actually three supply chain indicators, so the first one for me would be the decrease in supply chain lead times, basically the delivery times. So when you order a couch online, it doesn't provide you an estimated delivery time in 4 to 6 months. And if this seems like an inconvenience to a consumer, you can imagine the impact it has on the manufacturing. Then the second one will be the decrease in global container freight rates. Freight rates have tripled over the year from a little over 3,000 to now over 9,000, and these costs are passed on to consumers. And the final will be the decrease in crude oil prices per barrel. All of these indicators are obviously connected in some way.
Thank you. What an amazing, amazing discussion. And thank you for bringing such amazing ideas, insights into this discussion. I was just ready to jump in, but I'm like, I will let go my role of a moderator, and that's how the exciting this discussion had become. You saw me putting my finger on my mouth, and I was telling myself, shut up, shut up. But to all the listeners who are watching this, if you love this podcast or something like this, please let us know. Please also let us know some of the topics that you want to have a discussion on these, and we would love to include that. But stay tuned, as this is one of the many to come. And goodbye, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you for joining the Chain Reaction Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University's W.P. Carey School of Business. Please reach out to us at wpcarey.sem@asu.edu with comments and any supply chain management topics you would like us to discuss in future installments of our podcast. And remember to check out our website at wpcarey.asu.edu/supply-chain-management-degrees. We look forward to you joining us for our next podcast presentation.